Right, I'll make a start. So the bats of Ploughman Wood. Ploughman Wood is a site that has become increasingly important to me. It's a nature reserve. It's a Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust reserve, and I'm very fortunate to be part of the team that manages that reserve. And I spend pretty much, well, not all of my spare time, but a great deal of my spare time there, rooting around and seeing what else I can find out about the wood. But bats was probably the reason that I started to go more frequently, and as I went more frequently, I became more interested in the wood itself. So it morphed from being interested in what the bats were doing to just being really interested in the wood and what evidence is on the ground to tell us about how it's been managed in the past, and what its history is, and what features we can see in the plants. And it's just a fabulous place to be, as is any ancient woodland. So where is it? It's that frying pan, saucepan shaped object in the middle of your screen. So this here, hopefully you can see my cursor. This is the edge of Nottingham. So this is Gedling Country Park, River Trent at the bottom. This is the Epperstone bypass. So it sits in farmland, really, surrounded by farmland, with the village of Lamley, Woodborough and Loudon. It's a triangular wood with a village on each point. So Lamley, Woodborough, Loudon. It's been owned by the Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust since 1996, although it might be 97. I meant to fact check that one, but it's around about that time. So we've had it a fair number of years. And as with many ancient woodlands, because this is an ancient woodland, so what do I mean by that? An ancient woodland, in the strictest definition, is a wood that is thought to have existed around 1600. So if a woodland existed in 1600 and is still around today, we would call that an ancient woodland. The reason for the date is because planting woodland prior to that date was very rare, didn't happen very often. It did happen, but not very often. So there's a very, very good chance that any woodland that was around in 1600, its origins go back much, much further. And the first part of this talk, I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I found about the wood and how I think it's what its age is, or certainly what's the earliest evidence that we have of the wood. And we can take it back considerably further than 1600, even though there isn't, well, I've yet to find any records of the wood earlier than 1609, but features of the wood tell us that it was around much earlier. A lot of ancient woodland is on higher ground, and a lot of woodlands have that to thank for actually still existing. If it could have been ploughed and felled easily, it would have been in a lot of cases, but this isn't on that higher ground, but it does sit on a ridge, and the land drops off from the right of the screen into Woodborough, and down the other side into Loudon, and down this side, down this side into Loudon, and down that side into Lamley. So it does sit on a small ridge, as much of a ridge as we get in Nottinghamshire. We're not talking Lake District ridges here. We don't get that much high ground. So first thing, how old is it? How can we tell how old it is? The fact that boundaries of parish is very, very significant. So here I've drawn the parish boundaries: Woodborough, Lamley and Loudon. And you can see the northern part of the wood here perfectly follows the boundary between Woodborough and Loudon. You've got a funny shape to the boundary here as well, and that'll come clear in a moment. Parishes can go back, well, parishes were fixed, pretty much fixed in about 1180. So we can show that that parish line was pretty much set in 1180, but possibly predates that by quite a few years. So the Anglo-Saxons sort of didn't make maps as such, but they walked preambulations. They described a walk around the parish, and a significant feature of a parish would be its woodland, and woodlands are often in the corner of the parish, particularly ancient woodlands. This woodland here in Lamley is not an ancient woodland. It's a bit of a small plantation. So the fact that it's on a parish boundary is a big clue. So we can probably say with reasonable certainty that that woodland was around certainly in the 1180 and probably earlier than that. If I was to take us forward to 1609, we're very fortunate in that the Ploughman Wood was once part of Sherwood Forest. We think of Sherwood Forest as being around where the major oak is, and the minor to major project that John's just spoken about will focus on the Sherwood area as most people think of it now. So the National Nature Reserve at the major oak, and the heathlands at Budby and that sort of area. But Sherwood Forest was once all the way down to the Trent. A majority of this woodland that you can see now that I've drawn in green was part of Sherwood Forest. This was a survey, a Crown survey, because the forest would have been for the Crown, which was mapped in 1609. And I've redrawn those maps into QGIS and produced this layer. So you can see all the woodland that was originally there. And the first thing you'll notice is that Ploughman Wood might have been a bit bigger. So that's a very big piece of wood there, and another parish boundary with this bottom part of the wood. So actually, Ploughman Wood is all in Loudon, but it boundaries both Woodborough and Lamley, making this parish boundary argument that we can take the date back to the late 12th century very strong, in my unlearned opinion. Another feature that we'd known about for a while but actually hadn't fully gathered its significance. I've kept noticing, I've always noticed this bank here, and it leads into a ditch. And I've always assumed that was an old wood bank, but it didn't quite conform to what a wood bank should be. It wasn't very big. And then I started looking at this side more, and I started to see that it rose, went round at the top, and then started to drop off. This is the actual wood bank. So all of this is a medieval wood bank, which also may go back further than the medieval period. So this could be 1200s, it could be earlier. Parish boundaries often followed wood banks. So to find that we've got a wood bank along this part of the wood here, so it starts here and goes up to here, and then funnily enough it disappears. There isn't much of a wood bank at all along this part of the remainder of the tail of the wood, but on the 1609 map it showed as having a fence, so we still know that was a boundary. So a really important feature, and I was delighted to find that, and I managed to persuade the county archaeologists to come and have a look at it, and it's now on the inventory of ancient features in the landscape. Going a bit further forward, this is Chapman's map of Nottinghamshire in 1774, which is often said to be the first modern map county, and it is a very, very good map, although its drawing of some of the woodlands seems to be a little strange. Some are very accurate, some not so, because we can compare it with other maps and estate maps. Ploughman Wood, it's got broadly the same as the 1609 map, and all of this woodland that you saw on the previous photo, just here, all of this woodland is still there. So the woodland that was there in 1609 is still there in 1774. So we've not lost it yet. We will do. It will go. This woodland exists still. Well, half of that woodland exists, but most of this is now gone. Pretty much all of that is gone. So taking it a little bit further forward still, this is the fantastic map that George Sanderson drew in 1835 from surveys done between 1830 and 1834 of 20 miles around Mansfield. So he took Mansfield as his centre point, and it's a circular map and published in lots of different sheets. So you bought a boxed set of these maps and they all joined together. And this shows Ploughman Wood, not quite as big as it was in 1609. There's a bit of it left down here. And this is the first time that we see the name Ploughman Wood, because before then it was called Howerley Wood or Hoverley Wood in 1609, which was probably the origin of the name Hawley Wood, just here. But from that point on, we started to lose the wood at a rapid rate. So most of this grey area, so this picture here shows the 1609 woodland. Most of the grey area, all of this grey area, had gone by 1834. So sometime between Chapman's map and Sanderson's map, that had all gone. Then Hawley Wood was felled, and I found newspaper adverts wanting labourers to help grub that up in 1846. And then slowly, then this bit went, and then last but not least, this piece went. Leave Ploughman Wood pretty much as we see it today. But this was once very, very thin. It's very thin, almost like a very thick, well, it's more than a hedge. It's quite a wide piece, but we've made it wider since in 1997, since we took ownership of the wood. We've planted up that area. It was part of a condition for building the new prison. The prison owned this land, the Home Office owned this land before we had it. And when they built the new prison, it was the mitigation was to replant some plantation woodland, and that's what they did. So the woodland went down to from 123 hectares down to 27 hectares, and now it's up at 32 hectares. And that way it'll probably stay until we try and rewire the landscape. But probably the residents of Woodbury allowed them, and Lamley might not be keen on that one. So we won't be doing that anytime soon. That's the straight edge of the south of the wood. So all of that field that you can see here was trees, and this is the edge. This is a ghost of a wood. It's a very, very thick hedge with some woodland trees in it. So that is actually part of the wood. Those trees would have been at one time. So enough about the history. I could do a whole talk on the history, but I wanted to give you some context of the wood. Onto the sort of the wildlife. And the other thing we look for to tell whether a woodland's ancient or not, even if you can't find any maps or any other features, you can look for ancient woodland indicator species of plant. There are quite a few of them. It's quite a long list. The presence of 1 or 2 of them doesn't make your wood ancient. The presence of 10 of them getting more likely. The presence of lots and lots and lots of ancient woodland indicators is you're probably onto a winner, that you've got an ancient woodland that you're looking at. Here's some of the prettier of the ones that people go to see. Obviously the bluebells on the first screen. You visit Ploughman in April, you'll see a wash of yellow, wood anemones. Bluebells follow just a little bit after. And the yellow archangel flowers, this one just, oh, my cursor's gone. Oh, there we go, just there. Then one of my favourites, wood sorrel, the very delicate wood sorrel. Quite a bit of wood garlic. That seems to have increased over, well, certainly my time of going to the wood. Can't remember seeing quite so much of it. And other plants, but also 2 grasses. This photo doesn't really do them justice. Wood millet and wood melic. They are 2 ancient woodland indicator grasses. There are others, but they're the 2. I'm not a great botanist. They're the 2 I can identify. And if you were to look at the wood bank, when the wood melic's out, particularly, it's covered in wood melic. And it's often remarked that it's the wood bank grass. But there's another indication that our wood bank is very old. It's quite a mixed wood in a lot of respects in terms of its structure. It's predominantly oak ash woodland, so most of the big trees are either oak or ash. There are some planted trees that have obviously been crept in over the over the years. There's a few beech trees. There's some lovely hornbeams at one end of the wood. I think my favourite tree in the wood is a very spectacular hornbeam. And then underneath the big canopy trees, you've got field maple, hawthorn, and quite a bit of hazel. This is an area, this picture showing an area where some of the older oaks are growing. I've been going around measuring all of these oaks and trying to estimate ages based on all sorts of complicated formula, not just the 1 inch per year, because that doesn't work in woodland. But every time a tree has to be felled as part of management, I'll count the rings, and that's getting me closer to being able to show how old some of these trees actually are. We've got woodland rides. So bats love woodland rides. And if you were there in the summer, on a good night, you'll get bats flying up and down there. When you have a walk through the wood on a warm evening, often you're not blown away by how many bats you're finding until you find a nice feeding area, which is often over the glades. So it's not a huge amount of bats that you notice, but they must be there. We've got woodland rides. Open space within a woodland is really important for both the structure of the woodland and for biodiversity. And we've been creating a few new areas, and this is probably the newest area. This just taken a corner, 2 corners of the junction. We picked junctions where we didn't have to take that many trees out. There were just 2 or 3 quite large ones, but the open space has really made a difference. Lots of lighting, that helps the light get into these parts. And a grassland is developing. That one's absolutely full of wood millet a few weeks ago. But there's all the wood anemone starts to pop up. You cut a bit of wood down, the wood anemone seems to pop up as if by magic, even though there's been none there for years. It's been lying dormant in the soil. So lots of open space. We've got some coppice with standards. We haven't got a great deal of coppice with standards. So by that I mean this is an area where most of the trees have been chopped and felled and allowed to coppice back, but you leave a few trees standing tall. And in traditional coppice management, those trees would be your timber crop. That's harvested every 70, 80 years, depending on the species. And the understory, the underwood, would be your coppice, which you would cut depending what you wanted it, or if you wanted it for broom handles or for making wattle panels that stays in those, you probably every 7 years. If you wanted it for fence posts, you might let it go 12 to 15 years, depending what you want, what your market is. But really important for wildlife. We don't have dormice in this wood, but if we did, that's where they'd be. You can find history for coppice in many ways. Old coppice, you can find coppice stools on the right hand side. That's an ash stool that's getting on for 1 metre across. That could be 300 years old. You preserve the life of the tree. A lot of people don't like to see trees chopped down, but it actually preserves its life, prolongs its life. They just regrow and regrow and regrow. And the very oldest trees that you'll find in any woodland are generally trees that can coppice. The other evidence I found for coppicing was a really nice find in the county archives. It was a coppice workers book from the early 1870s. So the person that was managing all the underwood for Ploughman Wood, and it lists all the product that he was selling. And I'm slowly working through 5 years of accounts on that to work out how much product was coming out, so I can perhaps have a go at calculating how much coppice was cut in a year. But I'm some way off that. The spreadsheet is getting terrifying. We've also got a meadow. This meadow was cut, well, the area cut out of the woodland was around about the late 1890s. But when we took over the woodland, we sowed a species-rich meadow from Ashton's Meadow, which is a triple SI grassland that the Trust manage near Ploughman Wood, which is another one of the Trust's ancient woodlands. So that's where the seed came from. So in the summer, it looks like the main picture, and in the spring, you've got lots of cowslips in the grassland. And just beyond there, there's a nice pond with lots of rush, dragonflies. There used to be a house on there. Used to be a house on that meadow when it was first cut out. They built a farmhouse in the last years of the 19th century, and the farmhouse stood there until the 1950s, and that's an aerial shot I found online. And you can also see that the woodland seems to be much more open here. So this could be coppiced area. This looks like a coppiced area, and that is an area that we have recoppiced, although we're going to let that grow back over quite a long rotation. So yeah, there's a lot you can find out about the wood. That house there would now be in a pond. So the main event, the bats. So we've got 12 species of bats in the county, at the moment, including some rarities. Barbastelle is a very rare bat in Britain, but we have those, and I'll be talking a bit more about those in a moment. Leisler's bat is not a common bat in many areas, but in Nottinghamshire seems to be a bit of a stronghold, but not this part of Nottinghamshire. More the traditional area, what we now know as Sherwood. We check the bat boxes at Centre Parks and Clumber Park and find lots of Leisler's bats there. So these are all the species we get. Serotine, in terms of a Nottinghamshire bat, is probably our rarest. We only have one record of that bat in the hand, but we are increasingly getting records that are very convincing as serotine recordings, and we're pretty certain of quite a few of those now in a few areas, not many, but we are getting more and more calls recorded that we think could be serotine, so we may have them. We're pretty much the north of their range, so we may have them. So the bat boxes. This was an idea that we had talking about in 2014, to put up some bat boxes in the wood. Well, to put bat boxes up in some wood, but particularly in a wood like Ploughman Wood, and Ploughman Wood's the one we chose. But we wanted to try and do it a little bit systematically, rather than just putting a load of boxes up and not really having a plan about it, more than that tree looks good for a bat box. We wanted to be a little bit more thoughtful about it. It's quite a loose thought, but I'm going to try and explain it to you. So we set up 4 sections, and each of those sections that you can see on the map, A, B, C and D, was chosen because it's fairly, to my eye, distinctive woodland. One of them was very distinctive because it's a coppice area, and the others just look a little bit different, and I'm going to show you a picture of those in a moment. And the idea was to choose 4 trees within each of those areas, and each tree would have 3 bat boxes. It would have a standard bat box, what we call a standard bat box that you've seen in place, no end of places, I imagine. Probably not used as much now, but we thought we'd put some of those up. Some Kent bat boxes, because we wanted to be able to perhaps check boxes from the ground periodically. And those, you don't need to open them, you just use a torch and shine your torch from the ground and look up. We wanted some of those, and some hibernation boxes. So these are made out of 2-inch thick timber. So they have a chamber in the middle that is only 2 inches by 2 inches, like a square tube, and a little sort of letterbox here. These were all made by Chris Turner, a member of the Bat Group in those days, who now resides in Devon, but he's joined this webinar, which I'm really pleased that he has, along with Ruth, of course, also an ex-member of the Bat Group. And they're really, really good boxes. They're really standing the test of time. There's only a few of the standards that have needed repair. I've got 3 of them in my garage at the moment, awaiting repair. Well, they've been repaired, but just need to wait them up when I can put them up safely. preserving social distancing and all that. And so that was the plan. So the areas that we chose, section A must have been thinned sometime in the past, mainly ash. The trees are quite far apart, and a lot of light gets into that part of the wood. So we've got a very, very dense bramble understory. It's absolutely murder checking these boxes. I normally look like I've been attacked by tigers after I come back from doing that one. So that section. Section B is more a sort of, I sort of call it, it's more in the centre of the woodland, and it's more, the trees are closer together. There's mainly oak and ash again. Some nice big oak trees and some big ash trees. There's a bit more of an understory here, so it looks very, very different to section A. Section C, I'm probably stretching it a little bit. It doesn't look that different from section B, but there's more evidence of coppicing in this section. This is behind the meadow, by the meadow, just behind the meadow, behind the pond. There's some younger trees in it. There are some big trees, but it's mainly younger trees, and they are closer together, and it's sort of halfway between. So a bit more light gets into that one. So it's quite a bit of bramble, but nothing like as much bramble as A. And B has hardly got any bramble apart from patches. So it's more closed canopy. And then picture D is the coppice area. Well, when these boxes were put up, that coppice was only about 4 feet high. So those boxes were very much out in the open, and not as secluded as they are now. Now they're getting overshaded by the coppice. So the box checks, after we put them up, we then started planning a huge lottery project called echolocation location, and the box checks were neither regular or frequent. We just got so busy doing other things at the start of the project. But we did do a few checks, but we didn't find our first bat until pretty much exactly a year later in one of the Kent boxes. And you can just about make out a bat there. I'll zoom in, there he is, which I'm fairly certain is a soprano pipistrelle. I'm fairly certain that most of the bats using our boxes that I identify as pipistrelles are soprano pipistrelles, but I cannot be certain. I've had one or two that I've sort of assigned to common pipistrelle, mainly because they've got very, very dark faces. But that's basically it. You really can't be 100% certain. But whenever we've done DNA tests of droppings from the boxes, we only find soprano pipistrelle, not found anything else. But we have got common pipistrelle in the wood. So I think it's mainly soprano, but we may have a few commons as well using the boxes. But it got really interesting the following year. This was September 2016, when we had the surprise of our life, when we looked up and there, looking down at us, were 2 barbastelle bats. Now, this is a very, very rare bat, and it's still very rare in Nottinghamshire, but it was even rarer in Nottinghamshire in 2016. Maps. So you can see the distribution in 2011 to 2015. We've got a little clump of records here around the sort of East Bridgeford sort of area. We've got a record here near Newark from an ecologist, wind farm survey, and records at Creswell Crags. But the very first record in 2011 was here. Most of these other records followed in the years after, and mostly some of those were not found until sort of 14, 15. Because of that special project, quite a few of us met together to sort of discuss how we find barbastelles and where we look for them. And Matt Cook set up, who got particularly passionate about finding barbastelles, set up the Nottinghamshire Barbastelle project, which became part of the echolocation project, and the funding allowed us to buy all sorts of equipment like harp traps and acoustic lures and all the things you need to trap bats. And Matt and the team then busied themselves about finding about a known population that we knew was on the Lincolnshire-Nottinghamshire border. So most of the bats were trapped in Lincolnshire, but then they were radio tracked, so we could radio track where they were flying to in Nottinghamshire. They were trapped at a few sites in Nottinghamshire as well, so that added greatly to our understanding of that population and how far they forage into Nottinghamshire. And then we started to get other records. People were having bat detectors in their back gardens as part of the project, and we deployed some in the countryside, and we did pick up a few barbastels. And this here is where Ploughman Wood is. So that block got added when we found the one in the back box. And since 2016, there's been a few more additional records. We know there's at least one nursery site in the county. Probably others. There might be others, but certainly know of one area that has recorded maternity use in the county, which is not a million miles from Ploughman Wood, as the barbastel flies. So that gives you a bit of the status of the barbastel, and that's why we got really excited. We installed an Anabat Express detector on this box here, looking directly towards that box, which had a barbastel in it, just to try and get some recordings. And it really highlighted the limitations of those who use bat detectors regularly. This is called a zero crossing bat detector, and whilst that's a nice clear recording, most of them weren't. Barbastel is a very quiet bat, and it really needs a very sensitive detector that preserves all of the signal to display an echolocation call. But you can get them, it's just harder. But later on, we did install a full spectrum detector, an Anabat Swift, in 2018, and I had that in the wood for 14 months continuously, producing a great deal of data. So monthly surveys of all the boxes then began in October 2018. We thought, we've found these barbastels, we really need to get our act together and start recording these boxes more regularly. So we started checking them once a month from October 2018, and then from December 2018 that was increased to twice a month. So we've started to build up quite a lot of data now, and you can see in that box, you might want to count them, but there's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, certainly 5, might be 6 cells in that box, and that's quite a regular site now. I've just add now that to torch, use a torch in this way, you do need to have the appropriate license from Natural England. So this is not something that you can, if you see a bat box, oh, I'm going to see if there's any bats in there. If you haven't got a license, you shouldn't do it. And even if you have got a license and they're not your bat boxes, you also shouldn't do it, because I know how much these bats are disturbed, and I wouldn't want to disturb them anymore. So I went to visit a woodland where I saw some bat boxes. As much as tempting as it would be, I will never torch them, because I don't know when they might have only been torched the day before, and you don't want to disturb bats. So if in doubt, don't. And if you haven't got a license, don't at all. So the original sections, just going on the Kents, were quite interesting. They all got used. So that's the 4 years from 2017. You can see B and C were very, very popular. A was doing okay, seems to have dropped off a little bit, A, over the last couple of years. I'll give you a reason, I think, why for that in a moment. D was very interesting, and that didn't record any bats. This is the coppice area. Didn't record any bats in 2017 or previous. So the first bat that recorded was in November 2018. I've got a working theory on that one, which I think I'll probably share with a slide later when we come to it. Oh, I'll share it with this slide. This is the slide. So that's a picture on the right, on the left, of the new shiny bat boxes on the day they went up. And you can see the coppice is fairly low. It's sort of about this level. These boxes aren't enormously high, but they're a good 3.5 meters. The coppice is that high, where now the coppice is, well, off the top of that photograph. Theory could be that Is it because they were too exposed before the hazel coppice grew tall? That's why they weren't used. This coppice section is adjacent to the prison, and that has some quite bright lights. And could it have been light spill that prevented the bats using them? Because the lights are on all night for obvious reasons. It will be interesting to see what happens when we recoppice this. This is now to be recoppiced in 2021-22, so we'll be back to ground level again. It'll be interesting to see if no bats use it for a while, and then we'll perhaps have proved the theory. So the surprising discovery that Barbastelle were roosting caused the box rethink. We thought we'll put some additional boxes in, and we'll choose some that are supposed to be Barbastelle friendly, ones that Barbastelle really like. This is a CJM box named after Colin Morris, who works for the Bat Conservation Trust. And we added some of those into section C and also into new section E. I'll show you some pictures of in a moment. We also had this box donated to us from a site which has Barbastelles, and Barbastelles use that box, use those type of boxes. There may have even been Barbastelles in that box before. So we've got one of those up at the moment. I'll update you on the success or otherwise of that in a moment. Section E was chosen as it was different again. It's got a lot of bramble, lots of big ash, lots of big oak, no surprise there. But it's also got lots of holly. And I'd read somewhere, and I can't find the reference again, that Barbastelle like quite a dense understory, and if holly's in it, all for the better. So we picked this area as a possible area to target for Barbastelle. So we installed 2 CGM boxes and 5 Kents into that section. CGM boxes are supposed to be favoured by Barbastelle, but they've totally ignored them. But the pipistrelles really like them. There you can see four or so pipistrelles looking down at us. The Kents were made to a different specification. They weren't quite as precisely made as the original ones, and the gaps were a little bit different. And I was all for replacing them, making some the same as the ones that Chris had made previously. And just as I had that thought, a Barbastelle moved into one. So now they are obviously extremely valuable boxes that I'm not going to do anything to. So this section's done quite well. We've recorded quite a few species in this section. So as well as Barbastelle and Soprano pipistrelle, we've had brown long-eared and whiskered brants in this section in boxes. A bat detector was also recorded there for 14 months continuously, and I'm still going through the data, but just some highlights. This is February 2019, dead of winter, bats flying. So this hibernation, don't think that that's going to hibernation in the start of winter and don't wake up until the spring. If it gets warm enough, they'll fly. And you can see there seems to be a correlation with temperature. Whenever there's a peak in temperature, some bats, drops down, no bats. Peak in temperature, some bats, drops down, quiet night. Goes up again, some bats, and so on. Quite a few Barbastelles flying in February. Well, possibly only one Barbastelle, but he was flying around most nights. Into April, as you would expect, it gets much busier. So we were getting quite a few passes. Doesn't tell you how many bats you've recorded. All it tells you is how many bat passes the detectors picked up. It could be 50 bats passing, going past and not coming back, or it could be one bat passing the detector 50 times. So all it tells you is that the range of activity, but a good range of species in April. And then when you get to what you would call the sort of the peak of the summer, sort of June, bat pass numbers increase. And interestingly, more common pipistrelles recorded most nights than soprano pipistrelles. In the winter, hardly any common pipistrelles. It's winter when most of our bat boxes are used. So another reason I can be fairly confident that we're pretty much all soprano pipistrelles in our boxes. The Anabat Swift recording of a Barbastelle is much, much clearer than, there's no comparison. So if you are going to deploy a detector in a woodland and you want to record things like barbastelle and brown long-eared, you really need to use a full spectrum detector, not a zero crossing one. So this is the last set of boxes that were installed in section F. And this was a new section along the south of the wood, along pretty much the boundary of the wood. Beyond that big oak on the right-hand side is an open field. To the left, you haven't got far to go and you're in section A. So the fact that these boxes have become so popular is probably why section A has dropped down a little bit, perhaps. Now these are totally different boxes. These were bought by the Wildlife Trust as part of a countryside stewardship grant, the woodland stewardship grant. Provided some capital money to put some bat boxes up. All the other bat boxes that I've talked about so far were bought and paid for by the Bat Group. These were supplied by the Wildlife Trust as a stewardship. These are Greenwood Eco Habitat boxes. I was going to put Schwegler ones up, but those of you that are ecological consultants know that Schwegler boxes are incredibly hard to get hold of. And I'm glad I got these because they're brilliant. They're made from recycled polystyrene and cement, so 80% recycled polystyrene and 20% cement. They look like breeze blocks. They're not lookers as a bat box, but they do blend in well with the tree. And the person that makes them, they're made by one person, Liz Greenwood. She not only makes them, she delivers them, and she helps you put them up. You can't say fairer than that. And they just hang on the tree. And there are 4 different types we bought. We bought ones with 3 crevices, so they're a bit like a Kent bat box, and they've got 3 individual crevices, but they open out at the top, and they've got a bit of a cluster area. So that's a 3 crevice. And then we've got the same, but just 2 crevices. And then these ones where the gaps are a little bit wider apart are actually hollow. This is just a bar to stop predators getting in, but they're just a large open space, so they replicate the sort of rot hole that you would perhaps get in a tree. But at Ploughman particularly, they've been very successful. We've put them in some of our other woodlands and not had the success yet, but they've not been up as long and they're not checked as often. But hopefully they will start to show signs of being used as well. And there's a picture of some bats. You can see a couple of bats here, and there's a couple there. You can see they can move from section to section. They've got a nice cluster area. The idea was that these could get used as for nursery use. That's why I chose the south side of the wood, but to date they haven't been. So we put 9 boxes in section F, and then 4 boxes went back into section C. So we've got 4 of these in section C and 4 in section E. So we spread them around a little bit. So that's all the boxes. This is the total number that we have now. I think it's 78 boxes. So the blue bar is how many we've got installed, and the red bar is how many of those installed boxes have been used. So the original Kents, the Chris Turner Kents, nearly all of them been used. The ones that Angelina made, all been used, all 4 of them. The standards, only 7 of them been used, but we don't check them that often. We've only recently started doing ground ladder checks more regularly. Same with the hibernation boxes, but they are being used. All the CGMs, single 1FF has been used, not just by this interloper, this blue tit. We've now, over the last 3 checks, I've had a soprano pipistrelle using those. And then the Greenwoods boxes have all been used, but the 3 crevice seems to be the preferred. And I'm finding that in the other wood where we've had them used so far at Gamston Wood. 3 crevice that we go for. In hindsight, I'd have ordered more 3 crevice boxes. That picture there is a noctule in one of the hibernation boxes. We've had a few noctules now in those. And this is all the ground surveys that we've done since October, showing how the number of bats is increasing year on year, and also showing that sort of November through to February, March are the peak peak times. It is a winter site, and bats leave the wood in the summer months, and probably go to the houses that are nearby, mainly being pipistrelles. They'll be probably roosting in houses. One thing I'll just go back to that one. One thing that one doesn't show you is how many. It shows you that quite a few bats have dropped at this point. So you'd expect it to be, there's been a big drop in numbers there. But here, from that number 38 to about 43, that's only 5 bats difference. But that might be hiding something about how bats are moving about. So since December 2000, since before that, but I've recorded this chart from December 2018, which is when I started checking them twice a month. I now record exactly what slot the Kent bat box they're in, and obviously which box they're in. So if they change, if there's a difference in the slots, number of bats in each slot in the box, that counts as a movement. So a bat out is a movement, a bat in is a movement. So I just count how many times they've moved. And that's really interesting. You can see from here to here, there was a few bats different, but a lot of movements. So even though some of the boxes that we're going to might have had 4 bats in previously, might be the same 4 bats, but they haven't just been doing nothing. They've been out and about because they're either in a different slot or the different bats. I've no idea. But I think that's interesting that it shows the number of roost changes. And something I'll carry on, and hopefully it'll prove useful in the future. The original Kents were made quite precisely, and they've got a roughly average 15mm outside gap and an inside gap of 20mm. So by recording that, I thought, I wonder if there's a preference. And the pipistrelles definitely like the outside, the narrower slot. Why? No idea. Is it because they like to be more enclosed? Does it reduce risk of predation? Nothing can get in there. They feel tighter into their space. Is it warmer or is it colder? No idea. But it's interesting that nearly 3/4 of the bats prefer the outside slot to the inside slot. Again, as time goes on, we'll see if that carries on. There have been other recording methods in the woods. There's been some trapping, all done by Matt Cook, part of the Barbastale project, and then part of an acoustic law project that he's been working with. So that's a number of species broken down into male and female, and some species that we've never had in boxes there. So we've had whiskered in boxes. Well, whiskered brants, you can't tell them with hard enough to tell apart in the hand. You certainly can't tell them in the bat box unless you removed it. So we've never had a Daubenton's bat. We've never had a Natteras in the box. We've had Leislers, we've had common pipistrelle, we've had soprano pipistrelle, and we've had brown long-eared. So that is also showing that soprano pipistrelle is certainly been the most commonly caught bat in terms of numbers. Could be lots of other factors, but surprisingly, whiskered bat number 2. So what have we done with all this data? There is now a local wildlife site criteria for bats for Nottinghamshire. It's not been in place that long. And one thing that we were able to do with all the data that we gathered from Echolocation Location Project was to submit, I think it was 11 sites for selection, and Ploughman Wood was one of them, mainly based on the bat box records and the additional species that Matt found for us. It met the criteria. But as you can see from this is a plan of the wood actually ends here. But this is such an important part of connective woodland, we included that as well. And I believe this may be the area where I wouldn't be surprised if there's a soprano pit roost or 2 in there. We know there's a whiskered roost somewhere down the south of the wood in one of the nearby villages. So perhaps that's whiskered bats coming to forage. Who knows? At least 32 members of the group have joined the surveys. I do quite a few of the checks, either on my own or just with one other person, because as I say, I do go twice a month. We don't do group ones twice a month, and certainly I try and fit them in around when I can. But at least 32 members of the group have joined the surveys, and we've had groups from Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust, including the Keeping It Wild youth group, whose Zoom account we're using tonight. Thank you very much, Keeping It Wild. Nottingham Trent University have had a couple of parties of students come round, and we always talk about the bats then. And then anyone who just happened to be passing, a strange man with a torch looking skyward, often gets roped in. I always ask people as they're walking by and tell them about the bats, and some look at me strangely and walk on, but others are really interested. Hopefully we'll be able to resume group visits soon once things become a bit clearer about what we can and can't do. So that's the Bats of Nottinghamshire, now highlighting all the species we've got in Ploughman Wood, or recorded to date. So we've recorded all 9 of the 12. So just brants missing, and we could easily have brants in there. They are so difficult to tell apart, and they do seem to have a similar distribution to whiskered. Nethusius, they're certainly along the Trent Valley, which isn't that far away. So who knows, if we had a detector out on the edge of the wood, I suspect we'd pick one up. Probably less so in the centre of the wood where I had a detector. Serotine, who knows? I've got lots of recordings that get me excited, and then I convince myself it can't possibly be. But probably another one for the future. Thank you for listening, and particular thank you to the Bat Group for allowing me to indulge myself in checking all these boxes and including them when I can. And thank you to Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust for letting us put the boxes up in the first place. And a huge thank you to the 2 Barbasdale bats that turned up in 2016 and gave me a kick up the backside really, and said you need to check these boxes more because you might find something interesting. So that might not have happened, certainly not in the way it happened, if it hadn't have been for those 2 Barbasdale bats that got me incredibly excited. Thank you.